I'm Anita Krug, a Lou Douglas Lecture Series intern, and I would like to welcome you to the fourth and final Lou Douglas Lecture Series for the fall of 1990. Lou Douglas Lectures are given to honor the memory of Louis Douglas, a distinguished professor of political science at Kansas State University and a supporter of UFM from its very beginnings. Continuing sponsors of the series include University for Man, the Division of Continuing Education, Student Governing Association, Pre-Law Club, Ecumenical Christian Ministries, Office of the Provost, and the Department of History. We would like to thank you for your support of this series. We welcome ideas for speakers whom you think would bring interesting topics to the campus. Please contact Karen McCullough, the coordinator, or other board members if you have any suggestions. Finally, you are invited to the reception that will follow the lecture. This will be in the foyer and is sponsored by the K-State Economics Club. Now I would like to introduce Dr. Wayne Nofziger, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Anita. This lecture series deals with many of the issues that Lou Douglas found important: human rights, social justice, world peace, and international development. And I think it would be difficult to think of a speaker that we could get that could honor Lou Douglas more because of many of the common themes that we have between Kenneth Boulding and Lou Douglas. Boulding's biographer, Cynthia Kerman, writes that Kenneth, even at the age of 6 to 8 during World War I, was troubled by the British Methodist Church's support for the war effort, and apparently very soon after that decided that he would become a pacifist and join the Friends meeting. He was a League of Nations economist in 1941-42 and was fired in 1942 for publishing a call to disarm. He's concentrated on peace research and conflict resolution ever since, and in this sense, I think, again, this is similar. The emphasis upon studying about peace and conflict resolution is the sort of thing that Lou Douglas considered very important. He, in many ways, his biographer says, there's a great contradiction in the person. I'm sure we could say this of all of us. But Boulding is a pacifist, but at least since the late 1920s, he's not been a socialist. He's critical of left-wing illusions. An evolutionary economist, really, in the tradition of Adam Smith, the first scientific political economist, or evolutionary economist, as Boulding would say. But yet, despite being in the tradition of this classical economist, Daniel Fussfeld, his colleague and one of my teachers, felt that Boulding's heterodoxy, his sort of irreverent attitude towards conventional economics, made the University of Michigan's branch of radical political economics possible. Well, another attribute I think that Professor Boulding has emphasized, again, is one that Lou Douglas put a lot of emphasis on. Boulding was characterized by Ruth Nanda Anshin, who's editor of the World Perspectives series, as one of the handful of spiritual and intellectual leaders of our epoch. I consider the discussion between Reinhold Niebuhr and Kenneth Boulding in the back of Boulding's book, The Organizational Revolution, this intellectual jousting, in a way, between two of the leading thinkers of the 20th century, and I hope that you read this. It's not in the paperback edition, but it's in the original edition. And Niebuhr emphasizes the inherent ethically ambiguous choices large organizations face, which require coercion, and Boulding is very much troubled by the fact that the growth of organizations, the technology, the economies of scale that give rise to these growth in organizations make it possible for these organizations to have substantial coercion, and he tries to discuss ways in which these large organizations can contribute to freedom and a stress on individual rights. Another way in which I think there is a commonality here between Professor Boulding and the person in whose honor we have this lecture series is the emphasis on knowledge and education. And Boulding's writings have really focused on the way in which human knowledge plays the key role in the evolution of social systems. Both of these men had experience in Japan as a teacher. Professor Boulding at International Christian University, I believe, in the 60s, and he was very much impressed by this experience, and some of you may have heard his lecture this afternoon where he talked about the idea that nothing helps the affluence of a country more than to lose a war and to, in a sense, be able to devote your resources to civilian purposes. And at least his biographer talks of the way in which this experience in Japan influenced his idea of Spaceship Earth, which is related to his theme tonight. Also, Professor Boulding, and also Professor Douglas emphasized the idea of applying social science tools to real-world problems, emphasizing the integration of social sciences, and indeed of all knowledge. And in a sense, though Professor Douglas was not as prolific as Professor Boulding, and which one of us are, he's written, I think, over 40 books. Nevertheless, I think that Professor Douglas was very much interested in this sort of thing. Professor Boulding indicates that my purity in economics was destroyed by going to Iowa State College in 1943, something very much like Kansas State College was then, to become a labor economist. And I realized that it was necessary to study sociology, political science, the other social sciences, and science as well. It seems to me the irreverence towards received knowledge is an emphasis that Lou Douglas would find very much to his liking. Martin Bronfenbrenner, a well-known economist, says that when it comes to Boulding, there are no empirical verifications, statistical or otherwise, and likewise no predictions regarding the actual world. Funding for research for Boulding seems to be paying him to give him time to let him think. He's not a data gatherer, and his biographer says that Kenneth once indicated that he's declared that he's never really done any empirical research. Perhaps that's an overstatement. But his colleague, William Palmer, commented that Kenneth has more ideas per day than most people have per month. And it's this, I think, this is the contribution that he's made to the profession that I think is the reason for his honor. And indeed, many of us are hoping that someday he will get his just desserts as a Nobel economist. He received, for example, the John Bates Clark Award, which was given to a scholar in economics who, under the age of 40, has made the greatest contribution to economics. That's often a good predictor of the Nobel Prize. I must confess that I lost 50 cents in the Department of Economics pool just about a week or 10 days ago by putting 50 cents in for Professor Boulding getting the Nobel Prize. But I think that the thing that if he doesn't get the Nobel Prize, I suspect it's because Kenneth Boulding would much rather emphasize, say, having fun in life, trying to emphasize the kinds of intellectual topics that are interesting, being a bit irreverent in looking at the received doctrine concerning economics and doing a lot of the sorts of things that probably the committee, the Nobel Committee, would rather not put its emphasis on. I think rather than indicate a great deal about his background, I'll just mention a few of the other awards. He got the American Council of Learned Societies Prize for Distinguished Scholarship in the Humanities. He has been president of many societies, the American Economic Association, the Society for General Systems Research, and he was the founder of that. He was the founder of the study of the grants economy and was the president of that. He's had many honors, fellowships, and so forth, and he has written a large number of books. At this time, I would like to introduce our speaker, the distinguished professor of economics at the University of Colorado, Professor Emeritus Kenneth Boulding, who will speak to us on Century 21, An Age of Maturity. Let's welcome Professor Boulding.
Thank you very much. I hope you haven't raised too great expectations. Well, it's a great pleasure and honor to be here as this lecturer. I have a great affection for land-grant colleges, as you know, having been at Ames when I was a young man. This changed my life, I think. It made me realize that education was important. And that had to be linked in with the whole of society. So it's a great pleasure to be back in this atmosphere again. Well, I've called this the 21st century as an age of maturity, mainly because 21 is a magic number in our culture, although we seem to be moving this to 16 for driving. But we are supposed to be mature when we get to be 21. Maturation is actually rather a tricky concept. All organisms mature. They all start off as an egg or something and grow, and then at some age or other they stop growing and become mature. That is, maturity is the age when growth is fat. When you're 12, growth with weight can be brains and muscles. Certainly when you're 21, growth in weight is fat, for the most part, especially as we get a little older. I have a little bit of a problem with that myself. Populations don't mature in this sense. The population in equilibrium certainly has a very stable age distribution. People die and they're born and they age, but the average age distribution is fairly stable. Whether ecosystems mature is an interesting question. Whether there's something you could call maturity in the whole evolution process is an interesting question. I'm not quite sure about. Certainly, evolution has a times arrow. No question of that, I think. Certainly towards complexity. I'm quite sure I'm more complex than an amoeba, though I never asked one about it. And as this complexity takes many different forms in terms of cybernetic systems, and of course eventually towards intelligence. But there's no doubt, I think, that this is a process, I say, with times arrow. It would be a little presumptuous of us to suppose that we represent the maturation of 3 billion years of evolution. And I don't know, we may produce our evolutionary successor, though I won't like him or her very much. But it wouldn't be wholly surprising. It's extremely surprising if we're at the end of the evolutionary process. So if we aren't careful, we may be. in this part of the universe. Turning now to social, human and social evolution, we see, well, first of all, there have been very long periods of maturity. Paleolithic's always fascinated me because this human race seemed to stay in almost the same condition of culture and knowledge for 40,000 years, 50,000 years maybe. How do we do it? I don't know. These ancestors of ours were genetically virtually the same as we are, not very different at any rate, you see, and yet they presumably had curiosity and all this, and yet they persisted in the same state of culture for a very long time without much change in the artifacts and so on, with each generation repeating the culture of the parents, whereas we expect our children to be different from us. And then things start up certainly with agriculture. It's surprising how it took 40,000 years to catch on to that, doesn't it? It was something rather obvious. Anyway, what agriculture, I don't know, what is it? You probably know better than I do. Certainly 6,000 years, 8,000 years, something like that ago. With agriculture, you get civilization. Because agriculture produces a surplus of storable food beyond what the farmer eats. Somebody can capture that, perhaps early civilizations with priesthoods that said, you give us the food you don't eat, or else we won't do whatever it is and make the crops grow or something, you see. And then the priests tend to give way to the king, as in Samuel and Saul, you may remember, if you go to the Bible, the king comes along and says, hey, you better give me your food or else my soldiers will kill you, and that's very convincing too. That's civilization has a lot to do with that, and this matures slowly, but actually the age of civilization is not all that much change, I think, between ancient Egypt and Rome. In fact, I think the pyramids were more impressive than anything the Romans ever built. The technology didn't change all that much, I think, after about 3000 BC. Well, then, something like 500 years ago, we begin to get an extraordinary change. It produced the modern world. And something I've been very much interested in is how on earth did this happen? One thing that is very clear, that it happened in Europe. It didn't happen in India, it didn't happen in China, it didn't happen in Islam. Although if you're looking at the world, I suppose about 1400, a little earlier, you'd have seen China as the center of the world, the Middle Kingdom, Islam about the same level, and a little crescent around it, and Europe an obscure peninsula on the edge of the civilized world. Then something very strange happens. I don't quite know what it was. I've been tempted to put the date at 1453, when the Turks blew the walls of Constantinople up and captured Constantinople and occupied a very large part of the Balkans, up to Hungary, even, well, in 1480, I think, they even invaded Italy. So the Christian Europe, shall we say, had an enormous military defeat. And one of the odd things I discovered about history is there's practically no substitute for military defeat. You really always have some sort of economic or cultural expansion after it. Well, who won the Second World War economically? You know that one, don't you? So you can find many examples of this. That's not the only answer, but that may have something to do with it. Anyway, in 1453, Turks captured Constantinople. The first Bible was printed in Europe. And in 1451, Columbus was born, and in 1452, Leonardo da Vinci was born, and Amerigo Vespucci. So it looks like a good date to put at it. Then another 20 years we get Copernicus. That started things off. See, and you look at this extraordinary explosion of Europe, and I'm still puzzled by it. It has something to do with the fact that Europe was Christian, and Christianity was a working class religion founded by carpenter and tent maker and fisherman, you see, whereas Buddha was a prince. And Hinduism was a philosopher's religion, wasn't it? You see, it had very high philosophy, but they didn't think very much of the material world. Whereas the Christianity was a nice cruddy religion. It believed in the material world, and that may have had something to do with it. Anyway, we have a number of different things happening here. First of all, of course, the rise of modern science. Copernicus, in another 100 years we get Galileo, Bruno, Tycho Brahe, Kepler, Boyle, Newton, Leibniz, Dalton, Avogadro, Priestley. These have all come out of Europe, haven't they? If it didn't, Ben Franklin, the first American scientist, I think. There was a sort of a lapse after that, too. But anyway, there's no doubt, I think that modern science was a European invention. And even though earlier it was based on the foundation of Islamic science, and its early centuries, Islam was a very creative civilization. And then after its great military victory, it stagnated, didn't it, for 500 years almost. And Europe, as I say, developed and went into this extraordinary process of adolescence, we always call it. From the 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, these are teenage centuries. But perhaps whether we're getting to 21, well, I'll come to that. Well, the other thing was exploration. The technology, the rudder and all that, the shipping, the improved sails and that sort of thing, which had very little to do with science. Well, Columbus, so they said, how could Columbus miss it? If you could go 3,000 miles in a straight line, you had to hit something if you went west. But then China discovered Africa, the generation before Columbus. Chinese, I think they probably rounded the Cape. We aren't quite sure of that. But they were quite capable of discovering America. In fact, it would have been easier for the Chinese to discover America than for the Europeans. All they had to do was to crawl around the Aleutian Islands or something. It would have been very easy. There's some evidence that there were Chinese here in earlier days, but anyway, they never got around to it very much, at least after the initial sort of the Asian invasions across the Bering land bridge and so on, 11,000 years ago, whatever it was. Well, then you get a whole outburst of technical, what you might call folk technology, which didn't have much to do with science, actually. This, even the steam engine. Steam engine, what was it, 1711, I think. This didn't know anything to thermodynamics. Thermodynamics owed a lot to the steam engine. Even the railroad. Didn't have much to do with science, actually. This was just sort of what Adam Smith called skill and dexterity. And the agricultural revolution, the development of the turnip. I have a bit of a turnip theory of modern history. This created a change from the old three-field system of the Middle Ages, the four-course rotation in England, which tremendously increased the food supply. And that improved livestock, because turnips fundamentally were cattle food. I always thought they were as a boy. And this diminished infant mortality. This was the first population explosion came in England, didn't it? But through this tremendous decline in infant mortality in England between about 1740 and 1760, whereas birth rates kept on and on and on, you see, and that's probably why we speak English here, I don't know. Something to do with it. One can give other examples, iron from coal, things of that sort, you see. It's saved the energy crisis, because they had a big energy crisis in the 1600s because they ran out of wood. And if it hadn't been for Abram Darby and getting iron from coal, well, we might not be where we are today. I don't know. It might be a good idea. I don't know, but still. And then, of course, after about 1860 comes what you might call the science-based technology, chemical industry, aniline dyes and all this, you see, which you couldn't have had without Dalton and Avogadro and Mendeleev and so on, you see, certainly. And then the electrical industry, 1888 is the first power station. And couldn't have had that without Clark Maxwell and all the beginnings of electrical theory and all that, you see. And then, of course, the nuclear industry certainly comes out of science. And our modern agriculture to a very large extent, as you know here, the hybrid corn, fertilizers and all this stuff, you see. It is with this tremendous increase in agricultural productivity. It is a very striking phenomenon. You see it in the labour force, even in the last 6 years. In 1929, we had 21% of labour force in agriculture. Now it's 3%. And we eat pretty well, too. You see, 3% of the labour force now produces more than 21% did only 60 years ago. I mean, this is very much in my lifetime. And at the time of the revolution, I think it's estimated, 75% of the population was in agriculture, 75 to 80%. It took 75% of the people to feed the 100%. Now it takes 3% to feed the 100%. And this certainly is one of the results of science. Well, one of the other things is democracy. A little bit of that in Athens, but the Greeks, I hate to say this, were a bunch of slavers with a good press, and the Athens democracy, as you know, was extremely limited, and sort of kind of New England town meeting kind of thing. And the institutions of democracy also come out of Europe, don't they? It's maybe going back to Magna Carta, although that wasn't democracy, it was above. But the rise of parliaments and the development of the decline of kingly power and so on, and this goes on and on. I don't know when you date democracy. Very hard to say. Certainly by 1688 in England, I think you've got something a bit like it, but you don't really get it till 1869 or something. That's pretty late, and of course the American Revolution had something to do with it. And by this time, America was part of Europe, wasn't it? Potentially, and ideologically, and in terms of language and literature and all that, you see. It is Europe exploded all over the Americas, and then Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and so on. You see, it is while the other parts of the world remained where they pretty much where they were. Well, I say I'm puzzled by this. Really, I think it had something to do with this peculiarity of Christianity, as it was a working class religion in a sense, that made it to the top in Constantine or something, but rather to its detriment. But it did have a Bible, and if you have a Bible, occasionally somebody reads it. And then that upsets the apple cart, and off you go again, you see, or something of this sort. And there's certainly, then there was the Reformation, which happened because somebody read the Bible, I think, or something, and then the development of the Second Reformation is really going back to the Mennonites, you see, and the Quakers, and the Anabaptists, and Baptists, and Congregationalists and all that, you see. This had something to do with it also, which is fascinating. I also have a theory that Europe had an optimum degree of disorganization. I'm a great believer in the creativity of disorganization. You see, if you're too well organized, you can't be very creative. China was a bit too well organized. I've been interested in what's sometimes called the Needham problem from Joseph Needham. Was written as, I think 12, 14 volumes now on the history of science and technology in China, as to why modern science didn't come from China. And he told me, I met him some years ago, he said he still didn't know after writing 14 volumes about it. And there's still a little puzzling. Well, one theory anyway is that China was really too well organized. That the Mandarin was the priest, you see, under Confucianism, and that it was so well organized they didn't want any change. And if some carpenter comes along with a new idea, oh, gracious me, he hadn't read the classics, didn't have a PhD. Couldn't believe that, you see. Whereas Europe, you had all these, they had the separation of church and state, going back a long way actually, the separation of the Pope and the Emperor. You had the division up into all these little principalities and countries and so on, you see, and you could get away, so that Copernicus got away with it in Poland, and Bruno didn't get away with it in Rome. But Kepler got away with it in Prague, and Tycho Brahe got away with it in Denmark, and Newton got away with it in England quite easily, you see. And if you couldn't get away with it where you were, you could go somewhere else. And so that may have something to do with it. But it's still puzzling how you had this extraordinary upsurge, you see, of a new youth almost, isn't it? It is that, and you've got this great growth of population and the expansion of Europe all over the world and all that, and so then, and of course, then we got capitalism. When capitalism began, I don't know. In fact, I almost argue that any such thing as capitalism, there's a long historical process of institutions. So I once tried to make a list of the institutions of capitalism, put a date on them. Well, this goes back certainly 10,000 years, doesn't it? To how old is exchange? Lord, I don't know. But trade is very ancient, isn't it? Debt is very ancient. It's in the Torah, you know. Certainly in Egypt, we had debt and finance and trade and division of labor and all sorts of things of that sort. This goes back an awful long way. On the other hand, coming to Europe, you do get some very fundamental new institutions, perhaps beginning with double entry bookkeeping in Italy, about 1200 is it? Somebody maybe can correct me on this. I'm just an amateur historian. I never was much good at dates. That perhaps is a very one thing marks the beginning of a change, because for the first time you knew how much money you'd made. In the early days you were never sure what your profits were. Now you had accounting. That goes back, say, to about 1200 or 1300 northern Italy. Well, then we begin to get financial institutions, banking. I don't know how old banking is. Some form, it goes back a long way. Modern form, well, the Fuggers, what is it, 1500. Stocks seem to be invented by the Dutch stock market sometime in the 1600s. Trade, of course, international trade, this expansion all over the world, beginning to create one world economy, and insurance, things of this sort. That's about sometimes 1600, I think. You see, it is, and the corporation. Now, you don't really get the modern corporation, perhaps till the 19th century, middle of the 19th century. The whole succession of little things like that was produced world markets and price systems and financial markets, stocks, bonds, all this sort of stuff, and this certainly set the world off. Well, and oddly enough, Europe also produced communism, which again was a European invention. After all, Karl Marx went to a good Christian high school, you know. And this, in a sense, was a mutation out of this extraordinary fervent, the ferment, see, that was Europe. Well, then the question, as I asking what all this is leading up to, see, that is the are we moving towards a maturation? It is in the way that early civilization matured, I'd say, even after ancient Egypt. And are we going to like it? Not quite sure that we are, but there's one very fundamental principle, is that you can't grow forever. So whether this is a person or a society or a civilization or whatever it is, and at some point you have to come to grips with maturation. Now, I'm no prophet. I don't know anybody asked me to predict the economy. I always say, I'm very sorry, I'm not an astrologer, because there are profound uncertainties about the future. As I was saying this afternoon, one of the principal properties of the future is irreducible uncertainty in a system that involves information, so you have to be prepared to be surprised. I used to say you don't have to be utterly dumbfounded, but I was dumbfounded last year, I must say. All these things that happened in Eastern Europe, I didn't expect that to happen for another 25 years. This was a real surprise. And you have to be prepared to be surprised and adapt to it. It's an extremely important way of looking at the future. But on the other hand, there are also these patterns that you see in the past, and that so you can say, how should I put it? Some images of the future are more probable than others. But in this way, and of course, it's extremely important to have images of the future. Otherwise, you couldn't make any decisions. All decisions are about the future. Not even historians can make decisions about the past. It's too late. So that you have to have all economists know the decision is a choice among different images of the future in your mind, isn't it? And some of these may be more realistic than others. I had an image of today in which I was going to come here, and I believed in the existence of Manhattan, Kansas, and I was right. Here it is. Here am I. And, so that today. That's been very surprising. I rather expected to have a good time. I had a good time. I expected to meet nice people. I have met nice people. I had a very delightful day, and here you are all listening to me and not throwing any eggs or anything. You're very nice to me, and this was what I expected also. You see, that's not surprising. On the other hand, I haven't changed my mind about Manhattan. I thought it was here yesterday, and I still think it's here. If I'd come here and it had disappeared, then I'd have learned something. I'd have to change my mind. And as I said, the great success of the scientific subculture in increasing human knowledge had a good deal to do with the legitimation of failure and learning from it. You see, what you learn from is failure. All you learn from success is what you knew already. You see, what you learn from is the proper adjustment to failure. Now, you can make a wrong adjustment to failure. That's very easy to do, actually. But without a certain legitimation of failure, then you can't really increase human knowledge. Well, then another thing that's happened, of course, missed up on two things. We've had this extraordinary population explosion. World population has increased 3 times in my lifetime. And that's almost indecent, and the real trouble is I helped to do it. I have 5 children and 9 genetic grandchildren, which is well above the Malthusian limit. You see. I take some consolation of the Jesuits who offset me, you see. So that may be all right. Actually, I was an only grandchild, so I'm all right. Over 5 generations, I'm all right. You see, I don't feel quite so guilty about it. But at least it's a very, very intractable world problem. You see, here we now are at 5 billion. There seems no way to prevent it going to 10 billion, which is going to be a little trial of it. I'm quite sure we can't go to 20 billion. You see, I'm sure this will just overweight the capacity of the Earth, unless we have some technical changes that you can't see in the future. I suppose you could imagine a world in which we get in with our gene changes and we create an extraordinarily productive algae that can use 50% of the solar energy instead of 3% or something, and we can grow all the food we need on the roof of our house. And then there wouldn't be anything to prevent the Earth becoming one enormous Kansas City. I'm not sure that I like that very much, but anyway, nobody knows what the carrying capacity of the Earth is, because that depends on our state of knowledge, and you cannot predict the future of knowledge, or you'd know it now. This is a very fundamental principle, and so this is a great uncertainty. Maybe we'll go off into self-reproducing spaceships or something like Princeton nuts believe, something. I think it's a little plausible, but there was a paper by one of these Princeton people whose name just escapes me, the AAAS some years ago, in which he estimated that the carrying capacity of the solar system for human beings was about 1 billion times as many as we have now. Self-reproducing space colonies between the orbits of Mars and Venus, using solar energy and mining the asteroids, which evidently are beautiful mines because they're small, you see, you can get at them. And, well, maybe, I don't know. I won't live to see it anyway. I don't have to worry about it. Certainly in the immediate future, and certainly in the 21st century, we are going to have to face some sort of population control. Whether it can be very unpleasant, like plagues, and we seem to be on the edge of that now in Africa with AIDS and starvation and other Irish famines. This could happen, you see, in the next generation. If we can't, we don't get some population control. And so there certainly is a bit on the worrying side. Well, then the other question is whether, what about fossil fuels? This expansion of the last, certainly 300 years has been the result of getting out from under solar energy to a large extent and using past solar energy. Well, it is, isn't it? Fossil fuels are past solar energy. But as a very fundamental principle, if you have a fixed stock of anything, if you go on using it, one day it'll be all gone. And there's a good deal of evidence that oil will be all gone, perhaps 100 years. Certainly we don't know about reserves and that, but it's quite likely it'll be all gone in 100 years, almost certainly in 200 years. Coal will probably be all gone in 300 years, 400 years, you see, which isn't very long on a historical basis. At some point anyway, in fossil fuels will be all gone. And then we have to go back to solar energy. And then the question is, can we develop a technology, you see, that will utilize it? Well, we're on our way to it a little bit. Solar automobile races in Australia, I think, but we've got solar heating and solar cells, which have improved tremendously in the last 25 years. But still, the trouble with solar energy is very diffuse. There's an awful lot of it, but so the solar energy that falls on the desk here would hardly light a lamp. If we try to go to solar electricity, the Sierra Club isn't going to like all the Mojave Desert covered with mirrors or with even the solar cells. So this solar energy has a real problem with space, just that it takes acreage. And I don't know, well, we may just go to crops, I don't know, maybe the next generation Kansas won't use edibles, but burnables. Some get your research teams off and produce an extraordinary burnable stuff, you see, that'll grow in a field and collect it, and maybe that's very hard to say. You can't say what the future of that is. Then there's a problem which is even more intractable, which you might call a materials entropy. In fact, that we started off with mines. Colorado has a beautiful school of mines, and no mines. They're all gone, practically. One or two are operating, but not very much, you see. If you get all the stuff out of a mine, it's all gone. And then it's just dispersed all over the earth and how to get back. Well, we are getting magnesium from the sea, I think, aren't we now? But not very much of it, and it seems rather expensive. So that's something for the next 500 years, perhaps. It's really hard to see. Well, then we've got a very interesting question about economics. How can we operate an economic system, particularly one rather like the one we have, with no net investment? So you're looking forward to maturity, stable population, and pretty stable capital stock. So there isn't much net investment. Well, we tried this in the Great Depression. It wasn't very pleasant. Net investment was negative. 1932 and 1934, and in 1933 unemployment was 25%. Profits were negative, interest had risen. 1933 we were on the edge of a cliff. The surprising thing, it didn't go to 50%, really. The whole economy collapsed. I came to this country in 1932, actually. I did very well out of it. I was a graduate student, and I had a fellowship of the Commonwealth Fund, and they set the stipends in the 20s and hadn't changed them. It took me 45 years to become as rich as I was when I was a graduate student, at least on a per capita basis with 5 children. And in fact, I don't think until I graduated from college that I feel as rich as I was when I was a graduate student. But this meant other people were poor. There's a tremendous redistribution of income from the unemployed to the employed in those years, and we were really on the edge of catastrophe, and we just managed to avoid it somehow. And I suppose it's one of Boulding's first law. I often say anything which exists must be possible. And it's surprising how many people don't believe it. And we did have a Great Depression, so it must be possible. At least it was possible then, whether we corrected it. We know a little more than we did 60 years ago. Well, we had a stock market collapse, didn't we, in 1987, which had no impact on the economy at all. Not to be traced. And it's obviously that the stock market has just become Las Vegas. I mean, forget it. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter very much. It's just a casino, that's all it is. And people have fun. And that it doesn't seem to affect the economy at all, which is surprising, actually. I'm not quite sure how we managed to do that. So we do have this question as to whether we can sustain full employment in a stationary state. It's something I say we don't. I don't know the answer to that. I think there's a good chance we could, but I'm not sure we still know how to do it. Then there's another problem in what you may call the instability of equality. Yes, I think it was called this the Matthew principle. It's in the Gospel of Matthew. To him that hath shall be given, and to him that hath not shall be taken away even that which he hath. If you suppose you started off with absolutely equal distribution of assets, random forces would make some people a little richer than others. And if you're a little richer, it's easier to get richer. If you're a little poorer, it's harder to get richer. So that you get the instability of equality here. And that seems to be absolutely universal. It was equally true in the socialist countries already. They weren't very much more equal than capitalist countries were. Certainly when it came to distribution of power, the socialist country was more unequal than the capitalist country. An enormous concentration of power in the central planners. And so that's a tough one, and I don't know. Well, this goes back right to Leviticus and the year of Jubilee. Jews had the idea every 50 years you should cancel all debts. That'd not be a bad idea now. And redistribute land to the people who had it 50 years ago. Well, I don't think we ever did that. It would certainly have a disastrous effect on the financial system. But at any rate, we have a problem here, and we've been certainly running away from this with the decline in progressive taxation. You see, our tax system is much less progressive than it was even 20 years ago. It's certainly much less progressive than it was 40 years ago. And that we're screwing our children. The old people are screwing the children. The old people are being subsidized, like me, and the Social Security and all that, and the children are having a hard time, really. And this is something that is very disturbing, really. It is a sort of thing that they make one sort of a little embarrassed to be an American citizen. I love this country. Deeply, I'm a naturalized American, as you know. And I kind of fell in love with it, really. But you can be, a husband can embarrass a wife when they're in love. And certainly I'm embarrassed by what we're doing to our children, and that the rise in poverty. We had a tremendous decline in poverty in this country between 1950 and 1975 about. And then we got the war on poverty, and poverty started to increase. And it's increased noticeably, not dramatically, but quite noticeably since about 75. And the rich have got a little richer, the poor have got a little poorer, the distribution has become a little more unequal, not dramatically so, but moving the wrong way, shall we say. That's what's so worrying. And to have the richest country in the world with, well, at least 5% of the population and a much larger proportion of the children in unacceptable poverty, put it that way, is embarrassing, isn't it? And that this indicates a certain loss of moral sense or something like that. Well, then the other thing, of course, we have to worry about is war. Because of the technical changes here. My own argument, I'm sure you know, is that the nuclear weapon has done for national defense what the effective cannon did for the feudal baron. It made some kind of sense to have a castle and city walls when the weapons were arrows and spears. When it got to cannon, it made no sense. If you stayed in your castle, you got blown up with it. And moats weren't any sense either. This hit me when I had a holiday once in the Loire Valley. You get these wonderful medieval castles, and then comes gunpowder. There's one castle with a big moat. That wasn't any good either. You see, and the castles became tourist attractions. And the Hague the Horrible had to become gentlemen. Courtiers. This is the rise of the national state, essentially. You see, the national state, and the sense of the product, the very real sense of the canon. Well, I say, now we've lost our moats. We used to have the Atlantic and the Pacific. Forget them, you know. You can shoot right over them now, can't you? You see, it is that really national defense, as I say, has become obsolete. The only national security now is through stable peace. That's what we've got to work on in the 21st century. And there's good signs of it happening. I've argued, you see, we've had a continual stable peace is a situation between two independent countries, but neither of them have any plans whatever to go to war with the other or to invade them. This is us in Canada. Scandinavia got to this rather early, actually, in the 19th century. We got to it about 1871, I think. Didn't have it in 1812, obviously. Western Europe got it after the Second World War. The British and the French and the Germans and Italians aren't going to fight each other, are they? I don't think. You see, it is, and now we have a very good chance of getting it with the Russians all around the temperate zone. You see, but of course now we have the tropics, and the tropics are very young, still in a sort of pre-modern condition. And we see this in Mr. Saddam. He thinks it's Napoleon. He thinks it's Napoleon. He doesn't realise not 1812. I mean, it's another world altogether. We're on the edge of an enormous catastrophe there. And but still, we may learn how to deal with this. Well, then the environmental crisis. That's the last thing, isn't it? That this has something to do with the population explosion. For all the more human beings there are, the more garbage we produce. Obviously, that the tropical forests being cut down, and the CO2 problem, and the ozone layer, and you know all about this. I don't need to go on about this. We realise that the world has become much of a single system, even in my lifetime. And this is dangerous, because if you only have one system, if anything goes wrong, everything goes wrong. As you have many systems, then the thing can go wrong here, but it doesn't go wrong there. That is I've just been looking into the collapse of the Mayan Empire a bit, which is very, very dramatic and a bit scary, because here you had a pretty high civilization, really, producing artifacts certainly good as ancient Egypt and better. And then almost in one generation, they died. The whole thing just collapsed. And it had something to do with the instability of tropical ecosystems. You see, you don't have a winter. The tropical ecosystems are fragile. Whereas in North Dakota, even in Kansas, if you can stand the winter in North Dakota, you can stand the Army Corps of Engineers. Whereas in the tropics, then there isn't any winter, you see, and the human race comes in and cuts it down and builds dams and horses around, and the whole thing collapses. And there's real danger of this. And then this is a world problem, because it's the tropical forests, as you know, help to control the CO2 in the atmosphere and so on, you see, so that and we have a good deal of ignorance about that, and and there's really going on, I say. We are showing signs of handling it a little bit. I think we may solve the ozone problem, I don't know, by cutting out all the chemicals that produce it. We have the Montreal Agreement, but I don't think the Chinese signed it, did they? And that's this is a little worrying, and that if the ozone layer goes, God knows what this will do to Kansas. It can have totally unforeseen effects on the whole ecosystem of the world. So yes, it could be just enormously destructive. And there we go. Know about this, but it certainly is a little worrying. On the other hand, I've also seen great improvements in the environment, particularly at the local level. I grew up in Liverpool, as you know, pre-Beetle Liverpudlian. My boyhood was a filthy city, indescribably filthy. I was once in a fog in London. I couldn't see my feet. Now that's air pollution. You've never seen air pollution. You don't know what it's like. Even in Los Angeles, or even in Denver. See, that's all gone. All the English cities now sparkle. They're all clean and all that, you see. And there's even salmon in the Thames. But that's more at the local level. Well, Keynes once said there's no evil as bad as a moderate evil, if you don't do anything about it. And that some of these things are obviously becoming immoderate evil and all that. And then there's a more subtle and difficult question. How do we improve the quality of life? This goes a long way beyond GNP, or even GNP per capita, doesn't it? I don't really think very much of GNP, although it's useful. It's useful as long as you don't believe it. Like any statistics is useful as long as you don't believe them. But all statistics are humbug in a way. And they're useful humbug. They're evidence, we say, rather than truth, something like that. But you could have two countries could have the same GNP per capita, and one could devote it all to the military and building palaces and screwing the poor, and the other could have greater equality and have education and arts and culture and all this sort of thing. So there's a question of what is the economics of the quality of life is very important, particularly for maturity. As after you're 21, growth is fat, except in here. You see, and in here you can grow all your life. I think so. Look, I've been doing that. I've been learning all my life. Every time I go anywhere, I learn something. You see, I also forget names and things at the age of 80. I certainly feel that the quality of my life, I think, has increased all the time. Really. I've enjoyed life more every decade I've had. And I've enjoyed the decade of my 70s more than any decade of my life. I've just had a ball. I've been doing visiting professorships. I don't have to go to committee meetings. Just come and, scandalize everybody and then go away the next day. You can't beat it, with our 5 children, our grandchildren, we have really, I feel that I'm having a ball, having a very good time, really. And yet how, obviously, you have to have a certain amount of material wealth in order to do this, but on the other hand, you can have material wealth and be miserable. And the quality of life involves, love and honesty and morality and things of this sort. I worry a bit about this. In some ways, I feel the quality of our life in the United States is maybe gone down a little in the last decade or two, but maybe that's just old age. I don't know. You might agree with that. This is a generation gap or something. And I'm not at all sure of that. And we still have an enormous amount going for us. But we have a great problem ahead. But on the other hand, we also have a great resource. The resource is what we have in here, isn't it? See, this is. Each one of you has as many neurons in your head as there are stars in the galaxy, as there are galaxies in the universe. Kant, remember, once said that two things were moved into all, the starry universe without and the moral law within. I'd like to turn that around and say what moves me to all is the starry universe within and the moral law without. And the starry universe within is extraordinary, isn't it? I wouldn't have missed the 20th century, I must say. It's been incredible to have seen the volcanoes on Io and the canyons on Mars and the moon of Neptune, and now we're getting this wonderful map of Venus. You see, it's like living in the time of Columbus, isn't it? Almost. You see, we've had this enormous expansion of our image of the solar system. It's been a great time to live with all the wars and the troubles and the revolutions and so on. It's been an extraordinarily exciting century. Whether the 21st century will be as exciting, I don't know, but I'll be wholly surprised. See, I feel at any time there are a lot of different futures ahead. Some of them. Now, there's never been quite a time like this when the spread of futures, I think, has been wider. At the one end, we have utter catastrophe, nuclear war, the total collapse of our whole society. There's some probability of that, maybe only 1%. I don't think it's high, but it's not, you can't rule it out. On the other side, you have the better world, don't you? And everything, sort of everything in between. And my principle is each of us have this responsibility, I think, to ask ourselves, which side are you on? The old Labour song, you see. That is your life going to increase the probability of a better world by 0.001%? If it is, it's worth doing. If it's minus, it's probably, you should think about it. I think each of us has the option of increasing the probability of a better world. To be certain, nothing's certain in this world. But what is important is the change in probabilities. And that's what we all have to work on. Thank you very much.
Professor Boulding has consented to answer some questions, and I think what we'll do is we'll have people ask the question, and I'll repeat it, and then Professor Boulding will address the question. Do we have a question somewhere? Yes. Carl.
This afternoon, I think you made some remarks to the effect that you favored certain kinds of free market solutions to environmental pollution, for instance, a pollution tax or something similar.
Yes.
Okay, you want me to...
Well, I think perhaps people hit the back.
Yes. This afternoon, Professor Boulding made some remark about free market solutions to pollution, such as taxes and so forth. Would you like to elaborate on that?
Yes. Well, I think even the Sierra Clubs ought to come around to this. See, it is if you can tax pollution, then people have a strong incentive to do research on it, to diminish it. If you simply prohibit it, see, with penalties and fines and things, then people may wriggle around it. Mind you, I think a combination of these is probably what we're looking for. Some things should be prohibited, but on the other hand, there's a good deal of evidence that bribery is cheaper than threat. And that if it is, I'm an economist, you know, I believe in solving these problems cheap.
Next question. Yes, Leo.
Apply your principle of the loser in a war expands and grows after the war to the Soviet Union losing the Cold War.
Okay, the question is, apply your principle concerning the loser of a war being more prosperous after the war to the Soviet Union losing the Cold War. Is that correct?
Well, as I say, all general principles have exceptions. And I think the Soviet Union is going to have a hard time making this transition. And in fact, I worry about whether Mr. Gorbachev is going to survive it. For one thing, nobody's ever talked very much about how you make the transition from a rather rigid, centrally planned economy, you see, to more of a market society. And it's not going to be easy. I think the Hungarians were able to do it, I think. They can do almost anything. And the Czechs, I don't worry about. They're pretty good at this also, you see. But the Soviet Union has been a communist state now for 73 years. And this means that hardly anybody in the Soviet Union has any experience of anything else. And this means you don't have a subculture of entrepreneurship, you see, or something of that sort, the way we have in this country, you see. It is so that it won't be easy to make this transition, I think. Probably, I suspect we're going to have to make it rather slowly. main thing to do is just to loosen things up and remove the prohibitions on private enterprise, which they've done to some extent. But it's hard to do this with the large organizations and the large industries. You see, it is that if you, even if you develop a stock market, you're going to buy the stock. And that this can easily introduce uncertainties and difficulties in the transition process. So I'm a little worried about it, I must say. And I worry about Poland. I've been very courageous about this, I must say. But I was in Poland at the time of the 1000th anniversary, 1966, and one Pole said to me, well, the first 1,000 years are the hardest. And that's Poland, all right. They had a very hard time. And here again, you see, they don't have a subculture of entrepreneurship as much as so it won't be easy. But on the other hand, the central planning has so completely lost its legitimacy, it'll be really hard to re-establish it, I think, just because it promised so much it didn't produce. If you promise pie in the sky, it's hard to check up on that, but if you promise pie for the grandchildren, they turn up, and if there isn't any pie, and there's solidarity. But I certainly think they should loosen up, and well, certainly the Soviet Union could loosen up on retailing and wholesaling and so on. You see, they've tremendously overdone in manufacturing at the expense of distribution. It doesn't do any good to manufacture things if you can't get them to anybody. So that there's, well, I have to say, I'm not quite sure what's going to happen. It's a little worrying.
Yes.
Suppose there were a war with Iraq, for example, there was a big depression afterwards. How bad do you think conditions would have to get before there'd be some significant political, economic changes to the structure or government of this country, and do you foresee anything of that nature happening?
Okay, the question had to do with foreseeing a war with Iraq and the possibility of a big depression afterwards, and how bad would things have to get in this country before the political and economic structure will change. You want to correct me on, is that essentially it? Okay.
Well, even the Great Depression didn't change the political structure of this country, you know. It's astonishingly stable. The Iraq situation, well, if we'd put what we're putting into supporting these 100,000 troops into research on conserving energy, we wouldn't, it'd probably pay off better, wouldn't it? And that the opportunities for energy conservation are still enormous, and that it's absurd to suppose we have to get all this stuff out of the ground. And so that of course, in Colorado, we'd be delighted if the price of oil tripled, and we'd open up all our oil mines again. See, the shale oil. We've got more oil in Colorado than there is in Saudi Arabia, but it's expensive to get up. So I mean, the other opportunities are very large, and I think while there is something in the mobilization of the United Nations against the violation of a national boundary, you see that stable peace requires that you take national boundaries off the agenda, no matter how stupid they are. And Kuwait, after all, was an invention of the British, wasn't it? I mean, it's a leftover from the British Empire in the Middle East, and certainly look at the governments we're supporting there are, well, not very nice, I must say, especially Saudi Arabia, which is an extremely disagreeable government. don't know much about Kuwait, to be honest. After what we did in Panama, it seems to me a little hypocritical to make all this fuss about Kuwait, doesn't it? You see, because we didn't get the imaginations on it. Naturally, I think we killed more people in Panama than the Iraqis did in Kuwait. For nothing very much. Noriega may get off. I mean, everybody thought, Panama was wonderful. And so somehow we have to get over our Rambo complex in this country. It's very embarrassing. That's something to do with history and all that kind of stuff. You see, it is that even if we be a little more economic and do a good cost-benefit analysis of the Pentagon, might come out with a very large negative bottom line.
Yes.
You talked about the poverty in America. How do you feel about the American giving away to other countries on our aid to other countries compared to the poverty of the people of America?
Okay, you talked about the poverty in America. How do you feel about the giveaways by America to other countries, especially in the context of the great poverty we have here?
Well, the giveaways are extremely small. I mean, the percentage of the national income in foreign aid in the United States is about the bottom of the list. I think it's a quarter of 1% of our national income or something like that. It's extremely small, and actually it hasn't been very efficient either, but we certainly don't know very much about that. That's a very, very small change internally would be much larger than all we put in the foreign aid. Now, and a good deal of that is military aid. After all, we armed Mr. Saddam Hussein, you know. And this is crazy. I mean, we have to get over this business of being the world's comic mother-in-law, you know. Oh, naughty, under that, you see. And it seems to me there's a great deal to be said for finding out what your own business is and damn well minding it. And this is something we've got to learn.
Yes.
Professor Boulding, I was your student 25 years ago in Japan.
Oh, well.
Very pleased to see you here. 25 years ago, we were very worried about nuclear weapons, nuclear war, and all these nuclear problems.
Yes.
Do you think nuclear energy is the way to solve our energy crisis right now? Oil, for example. I'm just curious, what is your thinking after 25 years?
Okay, the gentleman remarks that 25 years ago he was a student of Professor Boulding in Japan. And he, of course, at that time and still does worry about nuclear weapons and war. He wanted to ask whether there's some potential for using nuclear energy to help solve our energy crisis.
Yes. Well, delighted to see you. I learned a lot more from my students in Japan than I think than you learned from me. Just look back on some of the great years of my life, I must say, and a great deal of what I did afterwards came out of it. And on the question of nuclear, well, as long as we have nuclear weapons, there is some danger of them going off, isn't there? After all, Chernobyl was designed not to go off, you know. And the nuclear weapons are designed to go off, and that's a little worrying just from the accidental problem. And when the president loses his briefcase or something, God knows what might happen, you see. I think the possibility of accidental nuclear war is quite real, and that we haven't really prepared about this. On the question of nuclear power, it's a technical problem in a sense, because Chernobyl put it down rather, and on the other hand, of course, if we can design the nuclear power plants not to go off successfully, then they at least don't produce CO2. Now they produce nuclear wastes, and we don't know what to do with them. It is, on the other hand, we could send them to the moon, whereas the CO2 problem is extraordinarily intractable. because we're not going to give up automobiles, and we're not going to give up electricity, and all this. And that's an extraordinarily difficult problem, I think. I'm totally ambivalent about nuclear power. I don't know. It's bad, but then the question is are all the alternatives worse? That's always a difficult question. Churchill wasn't said capitalism is a very bad system. It just happens all the others are worse. But nuclear power is a bit this way, I think. So I'm a bit on the edge about it. I certainly think that it's I think the light water reactor was a mistake. I'm quite sure that's one of the spillovers from the military, and spillovers don't really taste very good. And I think we'd have done better if we'd gone the can-do way. You see, the Canadian thing certainly seems to be safer, although it's also very expensive. I'm no expert on this. Whether maybe we have the only gas-cooled nuclear plant in Colorado, and it keeps being shut down. And it seems to be very inefficient and all that, you see. So the nuclear power has been an enormous disappointment, both from the safety point of view and from the economic point of view. Fusion, that's another matter, isn't it? See, it is, if we do go to fusion, there's enough deuterium in the top foot of the oceans to last us for about 500,000 years. You see, this talk about energy, stores of energy. See, and on the other hand, it's a little bit hard to develop a power plant using the sun. That it isn't at all clear as to whether the technical problems of pure fusion aren't insoluble. On the other hand, it's worth trying, because if we do go to fusion, the waste problem is much easier. Whether the safety problem is any better, I don't know. I know you have to ask a physicist. I'm no expert on this. But I'm inclined to continue research on it. Actually, put some research into it, because it isn't wholly out of the question. And while solar energy is the ultimate resource, no question of that. You see, it is fusion is bringing solar energy out of the earth, isn't it? Reproducing the sun in the earth, and that's pretty hard to contain. I don't know whether it's feasible, but anyway, it's worth a try.
Thanks, sir. Yes.
Given the large national debt that we have now, and the tax structure the way it is, the economic system the way it is, the rich getting richer, poor getting poorer, what do you foresee in the next century in terms of the middle class in America?
Okay, given the large national debt, the tax structure, the economic system, the rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer, what do you foresee in the next century concerning the middle class? And I assume as a part of that, what's going to happen to distribution of income, etc.?
I don't know. I'm not sure I know the answer to that one, really. I mean, that is all in favour of taxing the hell out of anybody who's richer than I am, and we all are. Mr. Bush doesn't need to be. I certainly in favour of increasing the progressivity of the tax system, which is, eroded tremendously in the last 25 years. And it didn't do us any harm before, as far as I can see. And certainly wouldn't do us any harm now to do that. The national debt is an embarrassment. It isn't quantitatively. It's the main thing that worries me about is the interest rate. We had a much bigger national debt proportionally after the Second World War. We were only at 2%. That didn't bother anybody immediately. Well, at 9%, now here we're financing nothing at 9%, and that's embarrassing. And it is a real burden, and the rise in interest burden is a very serious problem in this country. I think it's the most dramatic thing that's happened in the last 40 years. I think I was saying interest has gone from 1% of the national income to 9%. And this is a very severe burden on the rest of the society, and is one of the, I think, of the major origins of the rise in poverty. So that's really worrying. On the other hand, if we do balance the budget, well, we balanced the budget 30 years, I mean, between the late 40s and the middle 70s. We had the budget really went up and down, but the overall increase in national debt was negative, actually. We paid off national debt in those years. And that's why we lost all sense of the taboo on budget deficits back in the middle 70s. This is before Mr. Reagan even. I don't know. I really don't understand that. And that it's and there's a certain dishonesty about it. It's uncomfortable, isn't it? See, it is that we shouldn't be enjoying ourselves at the expense of our grandchildren. I've got too many grandchildren to approve of that. Although I enjoy myself, I must say.
Let's have one last question. Well, yes. Okay, Sam.
I'm concerned somewhat about job opportunities in the future. When we go to 5 to 10 billion people, there's going to be a need to create jobs. And is the economic system that we know in capitalism going to be effective in creating those jobs? I'm also concerned the low-income portion, like we have a lot of McDonald's employees, but they're going to be low-income people.
Sam indicates about, we asked about the job opportunities for the future, given the fact that we're going to go from 5 billion people now in the world to 10 billion fairly quickly. And what implications does this have for the economic system, for capitalism, for creating jobs? What about, for example, the low-income kinds of jobs, I suppose in services, this sort of thing, McDonald's, that type of thing? What would you suggest for solving this problem?
Well, I think here again, I think a lowering of interest rates will be very important. You see, it is because when you hire somebody, you sacrifice the interest you could have got on the money you spend on the wage and the hope of profit on the product of the work. And if interest gobbles up profit, as it did in the Great Depression, as I was saying, you see, this when anybody who hires anybody is a philanthropist or a fool, and that's not very good for employment. It also depends on a culture of entrepreneurship, doesn't it? Of people who are willing to take risks and hire people to become employers, in other words. You see, it is that this is can be rather a risky business, and but as I say, it depends on the culture, the overall culture of the society, and that I'm not too pessimistic about it. I think we've done pretty well the last 50 years, certainly. And that, but on the other hand, as I say, with the decline in, when net investment declines, as it has been doing a little bit, see, it is then profits may decline also, and that raises the whole question of the unemployment problem. And whether you can solve this by changing methods, or whether you have to go to subsidizing employment or something of this sort, you see, you have to, well, the point is you have to make it worthwhile for people to employ people. And the key here is the employer, isn't it? You see, the employer is the key to employment. And if you beat down the employer, you're not going to get employment. And the more employers there are, the better it is, you see. But to be an employer, you have to have access to capital. You've got some form or other, because if you're going to hire somebody, you're not going to get the money back till a little later. So you have to start off with a little cash, don't you? Well, this is the financial system and all that, whether this is going to support it. And that's the very large questions. I think I'll take the Fifth Amendment on.
Thank you very much, Professor Boulding, for stimulating our thinking about the 21st century. And I think you can understand why his colleagues have said that here is a man who can generate more ideas in just a 50 minutes than most people can generate in a month. I would like to invite you to go to the rear of the auditorium and to partake of refreshments sponsored by the Economics Club, and you'll get a chance to ask questions of Professor Boulding. In addition, if you have any suggestions about what the focus for the Lou Douglas series should be for the next fall, or speakers who might enhance our 11th annual series, please let Karen McCullough at UFM know, or let any member who's on the committee, and that we are listed in the program, let us know what your suggestions are. Thank you very much for your support of the series, and we thank Professor Boulding again for stimulating our thinking about the 21st century.